Title: The Shadows of Blackmoor Hill. Chapter 1: The Reporter's Retreat. The night Owen Madsen arrived in Blackmoor, it was already dark. Heavy rain poured relentlessly, pounding his car with icy fists as he navigated narrow roads shrouded in mist. Blackmoor was a small hidden village at the edge of a towering hill range, a place rarely touched by strangers. He hadn't planned to stop here. No, this wasn't supposed to be part of his route. Yet something had drawn him off course, as if a subtle whisper in the wind had guided his hands on the steering wheel. A voice he could almost hear, calling him closer. He blamed his fatigue, his sleepless nights, but deep down, a part of him was beginning to question what had really led him here. When his car finally broke down a few miles outside of the village, he was forced to walk through the biting rain, his flashlight flickering against the pressing darkness. Every step felt slower, heavier, as if the earth itself were trying to drag him back. The mist grew thicker around him, swirling in strange patterns that seemed to follow him like the shadows of silent, watching eyes. The journey stretched on, even though the lights of the village were barely a mile ahead, and every time he thought he'd drawn closer, they seemed to pull just out of reach. By the time he arrived at the inn, he was soaked and shivering. The building was an old, crooked structure with a sagging roof and ivy that clung to its walls like bony fingers. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and something else. Something metallic, almost like the faintest scent of blood. Owen stepped inside, shaking off the rain. His footsteps echoed across the empty room. Behind the counter stood an innkeeper, a grey-haired woman with a thin face and sharp, penetrating eyes. She watched him with a strange mixture of curiosity and suspicion, her gaze lingering on him a little too long. "You're not from around here, are you?" she finally asked, her voice low and gravelly. He shook his head, forcing a polite smile. "No, just passing through." "Through to where, I wonder?" she muttered, half to herself, half to the silent shadows lurking in the room. She turned to retrieve a dusty ledger and placed it on the counter. "We don't get many visitors here." Owen signed his name with fingers that felt numb. As he handed the pen back, he noticed her gaze had shifted past him, to the door that was still ajar. "You've chosen an unlucky night to visit Blackmoor," she whispered, almost inaudibly. "Strangers don't come to this village, not unless they're looking for something, or someone." Her words hung heavy in the air, lingering like an unspoken warning. Owen felt a shiver crawl down his spine, but he laughed it off, telling himself it was just the chill from the rain. Still, a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that he was, indeed, being watched. After settling into his room, a small, cramped space with a single window that overlooked the mist-shrouded hill, Owen tried to rest, but sleep wouldn't come. Shadows danced across the walls, flickering in the pale glow of the street lamp outside. The room was silent, oppressively so, as if even the sounds of the world outside had been swallowed by the mist. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with fragments of thoughts that seemed to come from nowhere. A hill, a church, a cry in the darkness. He wasn't sure if they were memories or dreams, but they unsettled him, filling him with a nameless dread that he couldn't shake. Eventually he got up and went down to the inn's dimly lit common room, hoping a drink might calm his nerves. The innkeeper was still there, watching him from behind the counter. Her eyes followed him as he poured himself a glass of whiskey, her gaze as piercing as ever. "You should be careful," she said quietly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "There are things in this village, things that shouldn't be disturbed." Owen chuckled, though it sounded hollow. "I'm just a reporter. I'm not here to disturb anything." She smiled, but it was a strange, sad smile, one that seemed to know more than it was letting on. "Blackmoor has a way of finding those who are lost," she murmured. "Sometimes it brings them here, and sometimes it keeps them." The words sent a chill down his spine, but he forced himself to ignore it. He was being ridiculous, letting the atmosphere of this strange village get to him. He was tired, that was all. Tomorrow, he would fix his car and leave this place behind. As he finished his drink and turned to head back to his room, he noticed a figure standing by the window, a tall, thin man with a pale face and sunken eyes. The man was staring out at the hill, his face blank, his eyes distant. For a moment, Owen thought he was a ghost. So still and silent was his form. But then the man turned, meeting Owen's gaze, and a shiver ran through him. The man's eyes were empty, hollow, as if they'd seen something they could never unsee. "Don't go near the hill," the man whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's not safe. It's never been safe." Owen tried to laugh it off, but the man's words clung to him, filling him with a sense of dread that he couldn't shake. He returned to his room, but he couldn't sleep. All night he lay awake, his mind filled with images of the hill, of shadows lurking in the mist, of something dark and ancient watching him from the depths of the village. And as dawn broke, he knew he wouldn't be leaving Blackmoor anytime soon. Something had drawn him here, something he couldn't explain. And now, he felt as if he were trapped, bound to this place by invisible chains. In the light of day, the hill loomed outside his window, shrouded in mist, its slopes dark and foreboding. He felt a strange pull toward it, a compulsion he couldn't ignore. He knew he shouldn't go, knew he should leave before it was too late. But something whispered to him, a voice in the back of his mind, urging him forward, calling him to the hill. And despite every instinct telling him to run, he knew he would answer that call. Chapter 2. The Villager's Warning. Owen Madsen sat at the wooden table in the corner of the inn, sipping on a pint of warm ale. The inn's dim lighting seemed to struggle against the heavy shadows clinging to the ceiling beams, and the fire in the hearth was a mere smouldering glow, casting flickering, uncertain light across the room. The quiet murmur of the few villagers scattered across the place was interrupted by the occasional creak of the old floorboards, or the sound of the wind howling outside, restless in its fury after the storm. Owen felt the weight of eyes on him. He glanced up, catching sight of a few villagers hastily looking away, their conversations taking on a hushed tone as if he wasn't supposed to notice. He smiled awkwardly, nodding to no one in particular, before turning back to his pint. There was an undeniable tension here, a sort of heavy, lingering unease that seemed to seep into the walls of the inn itself. It wasn't long before a man walked up to him, a weathered, wiry fellow with deep-set eyes that seemed older than the rest of him. His clothes were simple, worn, and smelled faintly of the damp earth outside. "You're the one who came through the storm, then?" the man asked, his voice barely louder than a whisper. His accent was thick with the local drawl, each word dripping in suspicion. Owen nodded, placing his pint on the table. "Yeah, Owen Madsen, journalist." He extended his hand, but the man only stared at it for a long moment before letting out a rough sigh and sitting across from him. "Blackmoor," the man said, his gaze fixed on Owen's face as if waiting for something. "Why here, stranger? What is it that brought you to this place?" Owen raised an eyebrow, a smile tugging at his lips. "Honestly, I'm just looking for a story. Something different. I heard some interesting things about this village, and, well, I couldn't resist." The man's face darkened at his words. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing to mere slits as he studied Owen's expression. "Interesting things? No one's got anything good to say about Blackmoor Hill. No one with sense would think of it as interesting. They'd think of it as cursed." The word hung between them. Curse. Owen felt a shiver run through him, though he tried to shrug it off as a draft from the ill-fitting window panes. The man nodded slowly, as if confirming something to himself. "The hill. That's what you're after, isn't it? You think it's some adventure, some tale for your papers. You're wrong, lad. People go up that hill, and some never come back. The ones that do, they're different. They've seen things. Things that crawl under your skin. Things that make you wish you'd stayed well away." Owen leaned back, intrigued. He pulled his notebook from his coat pocket, flipping to a blank page. "What kind of things are we talking about?" he asked, his pen poised over the paper. The man's eyes flicked to the notebook, and he snorted. "You think you can write it down? Think you can make sense of it with words? Ain't words enough to tell it? There's no sense in what happens on that hill. There's a darkness there that's not natural, a thing that sinks into a person, eats at them." The inn's door creaked open, and a blast of cold wind swept in, carrying with it the scent of rain-soaked earth and something metallic that lingered in the air. Owen watched as a figure stepped inside, a woman dressed in an old-fashioned coat, her face obscured by the shadows of her hood. She paused, looking over the room before making her way toward the bar. Her eyes met Owen's briefly, and for a fleeting second, he saw something in them, something haunted. The man sitting across from him followed Owen's gaze, a grimace pulling at his lips. "Some things are best left forgotten," he muttered. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, and he walked away without another word, leaving Owen alone at the table with his notebook still empty. Owen sighed, turning the pen in his fingers. He could feel the weight of the place, the oppressive atmosphere pressing down on him. The curiosity, the need to understand, was gnawing at him, though. He needed more. He approached the bar, the wood dark and polished smooth from years of hands resting on it. The bartender, an older man with deep lines carved into his face, glanced up from polishing a glass as Owen approached. "Another one?" the bartender asked, nodding at Owen's empty pint glass. "Maybe later," Owen said, trying to sound casual. "I'm more interested in the stories about Blackmoor Hill." The bartender's hands stilled, the glass hovering just above the counter. He set it down slowly, his expression carefully neutral. "The hill's not a place for visitors. You'd do well to leave it alone. Take the road south come morning. There's nothing for you here." Owen opened his mouth to argue, but the bartender turned away, leaving Owen with nothing but silence and the growing unease in his gut. It wasn't until later that night, when Owen had returned to his small room upstairs, that he heard a knock on his door. He opened it to find the woman from earlier, the one who had walked into the inn with her hood drawn up. She looked at him, her eyes intense, a hint of desperation behind them. "You're interested in Blackmoor Hill," she said, her voice low, barely above a whisper. "You need to understand. You need to know what you're getting yourself into." Owen stepped aside, letting her in. She pulled her hood back, revealing a face that was pale and weary, as if she hadn't slept in days. She looked around the small room, her eyes darting to the shadows as if something might be lurking there, before finally turning her gaze back to Owen. "There was a priest," she began, her voice almost too soft to hear. "A long time ago, in the 15th century, he brought people here, settlers. He promised them a new beginning. They followed him up Blackmoor Hill, and they never came back. At least, not the way they were before." Owen frowned, his pen hovering over his notebook again. "What happened to them?" The woman shook her head, her eyes unfocused, as if she were seeing something far away. "They changed. Something up there. It's not right. It took them, twisted them. The priest. He was the first. He brought something into this place, something that sunk its claws in and never let go." Owen swallowed, the weight of her words settling into his chest like a stone. "And you?" he asked. "How do you know all this?" She smiled, but it was a sad, haunted smile. "Because I went up there once. I was foolish like you. I wanted to know the truth, and I found it. But I lost something too." She raised her hand, and Owen saw the faint tremor in her fingers, the way they shook as if some unseen force were pulling at them. "You think you can write this down? Make it into a story?" she said, her voice taking on a hard edge. "You can't. It's not a story. It's a warning. And if you're smart, you'll heed it." She turned then, moving toward the door without waiting for him to respond. Owen watched as she left, the door clicking shut behind her, the sound echoing in the small room. He stood there for a long time, staring at the closed door, his pen still in his hand. The unease was still there, a gnawing, restless feeling that refused to leave. But so was the curiosity, the need to know, to understand what had happened on Blackmoor Hill, what had driven people to madness, what had taken them and twisted them. He glanced at the window, the dark outline of the hill just visible in the distance, shrouded in fog and shadows. The villagers' warnings, the bartender's silence, the woman's haunted eyes, they were all telling him to leave, to forget about this place and move on. But he couldn't. Not yet. There was something on that hill, something that needed to be understood. And Owen Madsen, foolish or not, was determined to find out what it was. Chapter 3. A Companion in Mystery. The morning mist clung stubbornly to the streets of Blackmoor, reluctant to give way to the pale sun rising somewhere beyond the thick blanket of fog. Owen Madsen pulled his jacket tighter around himself as he made his way through the narrow lanes, his shoes crunching on the damp gravel. He had not slept well the previous night, his mind haunted by the words of the woman who had visited him, her warnings echoing in his head like an incessant whisper. Despite the unease gnawing at his stomach, his resolve had not wavered. If anything, the cryptic warnings had only made his curiosity stronger, an insatiable hunger that drove him forward. He had decided to spend the day gathering more information, to see if anyone in the village was willing to speak openly about Blackmoor Hill. Owen knew the chances were slim, but there had to be someone who shared his curiosity. Someone who, like him, wanted answers rather than silence. He turned a corner, the old stones of the village looming around him, the fog making it feel like he had stepped into another world, one where time had stopped, and the ghosts of the past still walked among the living. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes on him, just as he had felt in the inn the previous night. The villagers, those he could see, kept their distance, their faces set in expressions of unease and mistrust. It was as if his presence alone was enough to disturb the fragile peace they had constructed, a peace built on silence and avoidance. It was then, as he walked past a small stone cottage with ivy-covered walls, that he heard a voice. A soft, melodic voice humming an unfamiliar tune. Owen paused, glancing toward the source of the sound. In the garden of the cottage, kneeling among the overgrown flowers, was a woman. Her auburn hair caught the light of the sun, which was beginning to pierce through the mist, and for a moment, Owen was struck by the sense that she did not belong here, that she was somehow different from the rest of the village. She looked up, her eyes meeting his, and Owen saw a glimmer of recognition there, as if she had been waiting for him. The woman stood, brushing her hands on her skirt, before making her way to the gate that separated the garden from the lane. "You must be the journalist," she said, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. "The one asking all the wrong questions." Owen smiled, though there was a wariness in his expression. "That would be me," he admitted. "Owen Madsen. And you are?" "Evelyn," she replied, her eyes studying him intently. "I heard you were looking for stories about Blackmoor Hill. You're not likely to find much here. People don't like to talk about it." "I've noticed," Owen said, his gaze drifting to the windows of the nearby cottages, where curtains twitched as the villagers observed their exchange. "But you don't seem to be avoiding the subject." Evelyn smiled, a small, almost sad smile. "No, I'm not. In fact, I've been studying the history of this place for some time. I'm an archaeologist, you see. I came here to learn about the past, but I found more than I bargained for." Owen's interest was piqued. "An archaeologist? So you must know about the priest, the settlers, the stories of the hill being cursed." Evelyn nodded, her expression growing more serious. "I know enough to understand that there is truth in the legends. The hill, it's not just a place, it's something more, something that doesn't belong in our world. And those who go there, they come back, changed. If they come back at all." Owen could hear the fear in her voice, the way it quivered at the edges, and yet there was also a determination there, a need to know, just like his own. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "I want to understand. I want to see it for myself. But I can't do it alone." Evelyn studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if trying to determine whether he was worth the risk. Finally, she nodded. "All right, but you have to promise me something, Owen. If things go wrong, if we find something we shouldn't, we leave. No questions, no hesitation. We leave, and we don't look back." Owen nodded, his heart pounding with a mix of excitement and fear. Agreed. They spent the rest of the day preparing for their journey. Evelyn led Owen to her small cottage, the interior cluttered with books, maps, and artifacts. She showed him old drawings of the hill, sketches of symbols and carvings that had been found there, and photographs of the abandoned church that sat at its peak, a church that had long since fallen into disrepair, its stone walls blackened by fire. Evelyn explained that the church had been built by the settlers who had followed the priest to Blackmoor Hill. It was meant to be a place of worship, a sanctuary, But something had gone wrong. The fire that had consumed it was no accident. It was an act of desperation, a final attempt to rid the place of whatever darkness had taken hold there. As the afternoon wore on, the light outside began to fade, the shadows growing long and deep. Evelyn lit a lantern, the warm glow casting flickering patterns across the walls of the cottage. Owen couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the shadows were more than just the absence of light, that they were something alive, something waiting. "We'll leave at first light," Evelyn said, her voice breaking the silence. "The hill is dangerous at night. The fog makes it easy to lose your way, and there are things in the dark that you don't want to meet." Owen nodded, though he couldn't help but feel a thrill of anticipation. He had come here looking for a story, and now he was on the verge of discovering something far greater than he had ever imagined. The fear was there, yes, but it was tempered by excitement, by the promise of answers. That night, Owen slept fitfully on the small cot that Evelyn had set up for him in the corner of her cottage. He dreamed of the hill, of the church, its stone walls blackened and crumbling, the air thick with the scent of smoke and something else, something metallic and sharp. He dreamed of figures moving in the fog, their faces hidden, their whispers echoing in his mind, urging him to follow, to see what lay beyond the veil of mist. He woke just before dawn, his heart pounding, his skin clammy with sweat. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the dying embers in the fireplace. He could hear Evelyn moving about in the next room, the clink of metal as she gathered their supplies. Owen sat up, running a hand through his hair, trying to shake off the lingering sense of unease from his dreams. He dressed quickly, joining Evelyn in the small kitchen, where she handed him a cup of strong, bitter tea. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, her eyes studying him over the rim of her own cup. Owen forced a smile. "Just a rough night. I'll be fine." Evelyn nodded, though there was a knowing look in her eyes, as if she understood more than she was letting on. She turned away, picking up a small pack and handing it to Owen. "We should go. The fog will be thick, but it's better than waiting. The longer we stay here, the more likely it is that someone will try to stop us." They left the cottage just as the first light of dawn began to pierce through the fog, the village still shrouded in silence. Owen could feel the weight of the place pressing down on him, the sense that they were doing something forbidden, something dangerous. But he pushed the feeling aside, focusing instead on the task ahead, on the answers that waited for them on Blackmoor Hill. Evelyn led the way, her footsteps sure and steady as they made their way through the village and out onto the narrow path that led toward the hill. The fog was thick, swirling around them like a living thing, and Owen found himself glancing over his shoulder more than once, half expecting to see someone following them, a shadow among the shadows. The path wound its way through the fields that surrounded the village, the tall grass damp with dew, the air heavy with the scent of earth and something else, something old and decaying. The hill loomed ahead, its dark shape barely visible through the mist, and as they drew closer, Owen could feel the unease growing stronger, the sense that they were crossing a threshold into a place that did not welcome them. Evelyn paused at the base of the hill, her eyes scanning the landscape, her expression tense. "Once we start up the hill, there's no turning back," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "If you want to leave, now's the time." Owen shook his head, his jaw set in determination. "I'm not going anywhere. Let's go." Evelyn nodded, a flicker of something, respect perhaps, in her eyes. She turned and began to climb, her steps careful, her eyes scanning the ground ahead of them. Owen followed, his heart pounding in his chest, the fog pressing in around them, muffling the sounds of their footsteps, the world beyond the hill fading away until there was nothing but the two of them and the path ahead. The climb was steep, the ground uneven, the grass slick beneath their feet. Owen could feel the cold seeping into his bones, the air growing colder the higher they climbed. He could hear the wind now, a low, mournful sound that seemed to carry whispers, voices just out of reach, calling to him, urging him to turn back, to leave this place before it was too late. But he pressed on, his eyes fixed on Evelyn's back, her silhouette barely visible through the fog. He could see the outline of the church now, its dark shape rising above them, the stone walls blackened and crumbling. the air around it heavy with the scent of smoke and something else. Something that made his skin crawl, that made his heart pound with a fear he couldn't quite explain. They reached the top of the hill, the church looming before them, its doors hanging open, the darkness within like a gaping maw. Evelyn paused, her eyes scanning the structure, her expression tense. "This is it," she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Are you ready?" Owen nodded, though his mouth was dry, his heart pounding in his chest. He took a step forward, his eyes fixed on the dark entrance of the church, the sense of unease growing stronger with each passing second. He could feel the weight of the place pressing down on him, the sense that they were being watched, that something was waiting for them in the shadows. Evelyn led the way inside, the air growing colder still as they stepped into the darkened interior. The floor was littered with debris, the remains of the fire that had consumed the place, the walls blackened and crumbling. Owen could see the altar at the far end of the room, the stone covered in strange symbols, the air around it heavy with the scent of something metallic and sharp. Evelyn moved toward the altar, her eyes scanning the symbols, her expression unreadable. "These symbols," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "They're not just decorations, they're warnings. They're meant to keep something in." Owen frowned, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the room, the shadows seeming to shift and move, to take on forms that shouldn't have been there. He could feel the fear growing stronger, the sense that they had crossed a line, that they were no longer alone. Evelyn turned to him, her eyes wide, her expression tense. "We need to be careful. Whatever happened here, it's not over. The hill, it's still hungry. It's still waiting." Owen nodded, his heart pounding, his eyes fixed on the shadows that seemed to gather at the edges of the room, their forms shifting, their whispers growing louder. He could feel the darkness pressing in around them, the sense that they were being watched, that something was waiting for them to make a mistake, to cross a line that could not be uncrossed. They had come here looking for answers, but now, standing in the cold, dark interior of the church, Owen couldn't help but wonder if they had found something far more dangerous, something that would not let them leave. Chapter 4. The Ascent. The mist hung thick over Blackmoor Hill, clinging to the earth like a shroud. The path before Owen and Evelyn twisted and turned, barely visible through the oppressive fog that seemed to grow thicker with each step they took. Owen felt the chill of the morning seep into his bones, a dampness that weighed him down and made every breath feel laboured. He tried to shake off the growing unease that gnawed at the edges of his mind, but it was like an itch that refused to be scratched. Evelyn moved ahead of him, her silhouette just visible through the dense fog, her steps steady and sure. She had walked this path before, Owen thought, and her confidence was the only thing that kept him from losing his nerve. He clutched the strap of his pack, feeling the weight of their supplies, flashlights, rope, a few meager rations, and wondered if they were enough. Was anyone ever truly prepared for the unknown? They had begun their ascent before dawn, hoping to reach the summit while the light was still with them. But even now, as the first rays of sun struggled to pierce through the fog, the world around them remained dim and colourless. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of their footsteps on the gravel path and the distant call of some unseen bird. It was as if the hill itself absorbed all sound, leaving them in a void that felt almost unnatural. "We're close," Evelyn said, her voice barely audible over the sighing of the wind that swept across the hillside. She paused, glancing back at Owen, her eyes hidden beneath the brim of her hood. "Once we reach the top, stay close. There are places here where the ground is unstable." Owen nodded, swallowing against the tightness in his throat. There was something about the hill, something he couldn't quite put into words. It was as if they had stepped out of the real world and into a place where the rules of nature no longer applied. The fog seemed alive, shifting and swirling around them, and the shadows that moved within it were not entirely their own. The climb grew steeper, the path narrowing as it wound its way up the side of the hill. The trees, gnarled and twisted, loomed on either side, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Owen could feel the weight of their presence, the way they seemed to press in on him, watching, waiting. He shook his head, trying to dispel the thoughts, but they clung to him, feeding on his unease. Evelyn came to a sudden stop, her hand raised in a silent signal for Owen to do the same. He halted, his heart pounding in his ears, the silence around them suddenly oppressive. She turned her head slightly, her eyes scanning the fog-shrouded path ahead. Owen strained his ears, trying to hear what she had heard, but there was nothing, just the sighing of the wind and the rustle of leaves. "What is it?" he whispered, his voice barely louder than a breath. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. Her eyes narrowed, her body tense, as if she were listening for something just out of reach. Then, slowly, she relaxed, letting out a breath that Owen hadn't realized she had been holding. "It's nothing," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Let's keep moving." Owen nodded, but the unease had burrowed deeper into his chest, a gnawing sense of dread that refused to be shaken. He kept his eyes on the ground, focusing on each step, the way the gravel crunched beneath his boots, the way the earth felt solid beneath his feet. It was the only thing that felt real, the only thing that kept him anchored as the world around them seemed to shift and change. The fog parted briefly, and Owen caught a glimpse of something ahead, a dark shape looming against the pale sky. He blinked, his heart skipping a beat as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. It was the church, the abandoned structure that had been the source of so many of the village's whispered stories. Its stone walls, blackened and crumbling, rose out of the mist like a spectre, a haunting reminder of what had once been. Evelyn paused again, her eyes fixed on the church, her expression unreadable. "We're here," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Stay close, Owen. There's something about this place. Something that doesn't want us here." Owen nodded, his mouth dry, his eyes scanning the dark, hollow windows of the church. The air around them seemed to grow colder, the fog pressing in, and he could feel the weight of the place, the history, the pain, the fear that had soaked into the very stones of the building. It was as if the church itself were alive, a sentient being that watched them with a malevolent gaze. They moved forward, the ground beneath their feet soft and treacherous, the grass slick with dew. Owen could see the entrance now, the wooden doors hanging askew, one of them barely clinging to its rusted hinges. The darkness beyond was absolute, a void that seemed to swallow the light, and Owen felt a chill run down his spine. Evelyn paused at the threshold, her eyes scanning the interior of the church, her hand resting on the doorframe. She took a deep breath, her shoulders tensing, and then she stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath her weight. Owen hesitated for a moment, his heart pounding in his ears, and then he followed, the darkness closing in around him like a smothering blanket. The air inside the church was cold, the chill seeping into Owen's skin, making him shiver. The walls were blackened with soot, the ceiling sagging in places where the beams had rotted through. The altar, a simple stone slab, stood at the far end of the room, its surface covered in strange, twisted symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the dim light. Evelyn moved toward the altar, her eyes fixed on the symbols, her brow furrowed in concentration. Owen followed, his footsteps echoing in the silence, the sound swallowed by the oppressive weight of the place. He could feel the unease growing stronger, the sense that they were being watched, that something was there with them, just out of sight. "These symbols," Evelyn said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "They're not just carvings, they're warnings. Someone was trying to keep something here, something that shouldn't be allowed to leave." Owen swallowed, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the room, the shadows that seemed to shift and move, to take on forms that shouldn't have been there. He could feel the fear growing stronger, the sense that they had crossed a line, that they were no longer alone. "Do you think it's still here?" Owen asked, his voice barely audible, his eyes fixed on the dark void of the doorway behind them. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the surface of the altar, her eyes distant, as if she were seeing something that Owen couldn't. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice trembling. "But whatever it is, it's angry. I can feel it. It's like the very air is seething with hatred." A sudden noise broke the silence, a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from deep within the church. Owen's heart skipped a beat, his eyes darting to the shadows, his breath catching in his throat. He could see movement now, the darkness shifting, taking on form, the outline of something that shouldn't exist. Evelyn turned, her eyes wide, her face pale. "We need to leave," she said, her voice urgent, her hand reaching for Owen's arm. "Now." Owen didn't need to be told twice. He turned, his eyes scanning the darkened room, his heart pounding as he moved toward the doorway. The shadows seemed to follow, closing in, the air growing colder with each passing second. He could feel the weight of the place pressing down on him, the sense that they were being pursued, that something was reaching out, trying to pull them back. They stumbled out of the church, the fog swirling around them, the cold air biting at their skin. Owen could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the fear gripping him, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Evelyn was beside him, her eyes wide, her face pale, her hand still clutching his arm. "We shouldn't have come," she said, her voice trembling, her eyes scanning the mist-shrouded hillside. "There's something here, Owen, something that wants us gone." Owen nodded, his mouth dry, his eyes scanning the dark outline of the church, the way it seemed to loom over them, a dark, malevolent presence. He could feel the fear still gnawing at him, the sense that they had narrowly escaped something that would not let them go so easily. "We need to get back to the village," Evelyn said, her voice urgent, her eyes locking onto Owen's. "We need to get away from this place before it's too late." Owen nodded, his heart pounding, his eyes fixed on the path that led back down the hill, the fog swallowing it, making it almost impossible to see. He could feel the weight of the place pressing down on him, the sense that they were being watched, that something was waiting for them to make a mistake, to cross a line that could not be uncrossed. They turned. Their footsteps hurried as they began their descent, the fog pressing in around them, the wind howling through the trees, the shadows shifting and swirling, always just out of sight. Owen could feel the fear gnawing at him, the sense that they were not alone, that something was following them, something that would not rest until they were gone. The path seemed longer now, the fog thicker, the world around them fading away until there was nothing but the two of them and the darkness. Owen could hear Evelyn's breath, ragged and uneven, could feel the tremor in his own hands as he gripped the strap of his pack, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. They reached the base of the hill, the village just visible through the mist, the outline of the cottages a comforting sight. Owen felt a wave of relief wash over him, his heart still pounding, his breath coming in gasps. They had made it. They had escaped. But as they approached the village, Owen couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them, that the darkness of Blackmoor Hill had not let them go so easily. He could feel it still, a presence at the edge of his mind, a whisper in the fog, a reminder that they had crossed a line, that they had seen something that was not meant to be seen. And he knew deep down that this was only the beginning, that whatever they had awakened on Blackmoor Hill, it was not finished with them yet. Chapter 5. The Burned Crypt. The sun was nowhere to be found that morning, as if it had forsaken the world and left it to the mercy of the unending fog that blanketed Blackmoor Hill. Evelyn and Owen stood at the edge of the churchyard, the skeletal remains of gravestones jutting out of the earth like broken teeth. There was a chill in the air that went beyond the dampness of the fog, a cold that seemed to seep into their bones, a cold that carried with it the promise of something far worse than frostbite. Evelyn tightened her grip on the flashlight, her knuckles white, her eyes fixed on the darkened outline of the church. The building seemed different now, more sinister in the light of day. Or perhaps it was just the knowledge of what they had felt within its walls that made it seem so. Owen swallowed, his throat dry, his gaze shifting to the doorway, its broken doors hanging limp, as if the church itself had given up, no longer caring who or what entered. "The crypt," Evelyn said, her voice low, almost drowned out by the sighing of the wind. "It should be beneath the altar. If the maps I've seen are accurate, that's where they buried him, the priest. And maybe we'll find something that explains all of this." Owen nodded, though his heart hammered in his chest. He had always thought of himself as a rational man, someone who believed in facts, in evidence. But Blackmoor Hill was not a place that cared for reason. There was something here, something ancient and malevolent, that defied explanation. And yet, even knowing this, He could not bring himself to turn away. He needed to understand. Needed to know what had happened here. They moved forward, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of moss that covered the churchyard, the fog swirling around them, clinging to their clothes like a living thing. Owen glanced over his shoulder, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The village was barely visible through the mist, the cottages nothing more than shadowy outlines, their windows dark and empty. He could feel it again, that sense of being watched, of unseen eyes following their every move. Evelyn led the way into the church, her flashlight cutting through the gloom, the beam dancing across the blackened walls, the rotting pews. Owen followed, his breath catching in his throat as he stepped over the threshold. The air inside was heavy, thick with the scent of damp and decay, and something else, something metallic and sharp that made his skin crawl. They approached the altar, its surface covered in strange twisted symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the dim light. Evelyn knelt, her fingers tracing the carvings, her brow furrowed in concentration. Owen stood behind her, his eyes scanning the shadows that gathered at the edges of the room, the darkness seeming to shift and move, as if alive. "Here," Evelyn said, her voice barely more than a whisper. She pointed to a section of the floor, the stone tiles worn and cracked. "There should be an entrance here, a way down to the crypt. Help me move this." Owen knelt beside her, his fingers brushing against the cold stone. Together, they worked to shift the heavy slab, their muscles straining, the stone scraping against the floor with a sound that echoed through the empty church. Finally, with a groan of effort, the slab shifted, revealing a dark, gaping hole beneath. Evelyn shone her flashlight into the hole, the beam revealing a narrow staircase, the steps worn smooth by centuries of use. The air that rose from the crypt was colder still, the scent of damp earth and something far worse wafting up from the darkness below. Owen felt a shiver run down his spine, his stomach churning with a mix of fear and anticipation. "Are you sure about this?" Owen asked, his voice trembling, his eyes fixed on the dark void before them. Evelyn looked at him, her eyes filled with determination, though he could see the fear there as well. "We came here for answers, Owen, and they're down there. We have to know. We have to understand what happened." Owen swallowed, his throat dry, and nodded. "All right, let's go." Evelyn went first, her footsteps careful on the narrow stairs, her flashlight held before her, the beam cutting through the darkness. Owen followed, his hand resting on the damp, cold stone of the wall, his heart pounding in his chest. The air grew colder with each step, the darkness pressing in around them, the silence absolute, broken only by the creak of the old stairs and the sound of their breathing. They reached the bottom of the stairs, the crypt opening up before them. A low, vaulted chamber, the walls lined with niches, each one holding the remains of the long dead. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the cold seeping into Owen's bones, making him shiver. He shone his flashlight across the chamber, the beam revealing the skeletal remains, their hollow eye sockets seeming to follow them as they moved. "Over here," Evelyn said, her voice hushed, her flashlight fixed on a stone sarcophagus that lay in the center of the crypt. The surface was blackened, charred, as if it had been caught in a fire, the edges cracked and crumbling. Strange symbols were carved into the stone, the same twisted shapes that adorned the altar above. Evelyn knelt beside the sarcophagus, her fingers brushing against the carvings, her brow furrowed in concentration. "These symbols, they're not just decorations," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "They're wards. Someone tried to seal something in here, something they were afraid of." Owen swallowed, his eyes scanning the darkness that gathered at the edges of the crypt, the shadows seeming to shift and move, to take on forms that shouldn't have been there. He could feel the fear growing stronger, the sense that they had crossed a line, that they were no longer alone. "Do you think it's still here?" Owen asked, his voice barely audible, his eyes fixed on the dark void of the doorway behind them. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the surface of the sarcophagus, her eyes distant, as if she were seeing something that Owen couldn't. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice trembling. "But whatever it is, it's angry. I can feel it. It's like the very air is seething with hatred. A sudden noise broke the silence, a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from deep within the crypt. Owen's heart skipped a beat, his eyes darting to the shadows, his breath catching in his throat. He could see movement now, the darkness shifting, taking on form, the outline of something that shouldn't exist. Evelyn turned, her eyes wide, her face pale. "We need to leave," she said, her voice urgent, her hand reaching for Owen's arm. "Now." Owen didn't need to be told twice. He turned, his eyes scanning the darkened crypt, his heart pounding as he moved toward the staircase. The shadows seemed to follow, closing in, the air growing colder with each passing second. He could feel the weight of the place pressing down on him, the sense that they were being pursued, that something was reaching out, trying to pull them back. They stumbled up the stairs, the darkness pressing in around them, the cold biting at their skin. Owen could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the fear gripping him, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Evelyn was ahead of him, her flashlight bobbing as she climbed, her eyes wide with fear. They burst out of the crypt, the dim light of the church almost blinding after the darkness below. Owen could feel the cold air of the crypt still clinging to him, the sense that they had brought something back with them, something that did not belong in the light of day. "We have to seal it," Evelyn said, her voice trembling, her hands shaking as she pushed the heavy stone slab back into place, covering the entrance to the crypt. Owen helped her, their muscles straining, the stone scraping against the floor with a sound that echoed through the empty church. When the slab was finally in place, they both stepped back, their breath coming in gasps, their eyes fixed on the floor, the dark outline of the slab seeming to pulse with a life of its own. Owen could feel the fear still gnawing at him, the sense that they had narrowly escaped something that would not let them go so easily. "We shouldn't have come," Evelyn said, her voice barely more than a whisper, her eyes fixed on the stone slab. "There's something down there, Owen. Something that wants to be free." Owen nodded, his mouth dry, his eyes scanning the darkened church, the shadows that seemed to gather at the edges of the room, their forms shifting, their whispers growing louder. He could feel the weight of the place pressing down on him, the sense that they were being watched, that something was waiting for them to make a mistake, to cross a line that could not be uncrossed. They turned, their footsteps echoing in the silence as they made their way to the entrance of the church, the cold air biting at their skin, the fog swirling outside, a reminder that they were still within the grasp of Blackmoor Hill. Owen glanced back, his eyes scanning the dark interior of the church, the shadows that seemed to pulse and shift, a reminder of what lay beneath. They stepped out into the fog, the cold air filling their lungs, the village barely visible through the mist. Owen could feel the fear still gnawing at him, the sense that they had awakened something that was not meant to be disturbed. He could hear the whispers still, faint and distant, carried on the wind, a reminder that they had crossed a line, that they had seen something that was not meant to be seen. And he knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning, that whatever they had found in the crypt, it was not finished with them yet. The darkness of Blackmoor Hill had not let them go, and Owen could feel its presence still, a shadow at the edge of his mind, a reminder that they were not alone, that they had seen something that could not be unseen. Chapter 6. Descent into darkness. The night was unnaturally dark, as if the sky had been swallowed by a black void, and not even the feeble glow of the moon could pierce the fog that enveloped Blackmoor Hill. Owen and Evelyn had retreated to the safety of her small cottage after their harrowing encounter at the church, but safety was a fragile concept, and one that seemed to crumble as the night wore on. The fire that burned in the small hearth was weak, the flames barely more than embers, casting flickering shadows across the walls that seemed to dance and twist, taking on forms that should not have been there. The room felt stifling, the air heavy with unspoken fear. Owen could feel the tension building between them, the silence hanging thick as Evelyn sat hunched over her notes, her eyes darting toward the window every few moments, as if she expected to see something staring back at her from the darkness beyond. Owen swallowed, his throat dry. He could hear it, the whispers, faint and distant, carried on the wind that howled through the narrow lanes of the village. They were words he couldn't quite understand, voices that seemed to speak directly to him, urging him to return to the hill, to see what lay beneath the surface of the darkness they had disturbed. He shook his head, trying to dispel the thoughts, but they clung to him, growing louder with each passing moment. "You hear it too, don't you?" Evelyn's voice broke the silence, her eyes meeting Owen's, her face pale and drawn. There was something in her gaze that chilled him to the core, a mixture of fear and understanding, as if she knew exactly what he was experiencing. Owen nodded, his jaw clenched. "It's like they're calling to me," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I can't make out the words, but I can feel them. They want us back there." Evelyn looked away, her eyes focusing on the flickering flames in the hearth. "It's not just the hill," she said, her voice trembling. "It's the entire place. It's like a shadow that follows you, that seeps into your thoughts, your dreams. I think we've awakened something, Owen, and now it won't rest until we're back there." Owen took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. "We shouldn't have gone down there," he said, his voice filled with regret. "But now that we have, I don't think it's going to let us go." Evelyn turned to him, her expression hardening. "Maybe we need to face it," she said, her eyes intense. "Maybe the only way to get out of this is to go back, to finish what we started." Owen hesitated, his stomach churning at the thought of returning to that crypt, to the darkness that had nearly swallowed them whole. But Evelyn was right. There was no escaping this, not unless they understood what they were dealing with. And maybe, just maybe, they could put an end to it. "All right," Owen said, his voice steadying. "We go back, but we have to be careful. We can't make the same mistakes we made before." Evelyn nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "We'll need to be prepared. There's more going on here than just some old legend. This place, it's alive, Owen, and it's angry." They spent the next hour gathering their supplies, flashlights, ropes, a small rusted shovel that Evelyn had found in the shed behind her cottage. There was a palpable sense of urgency in their movements, as if they knew they were running out of time, that the darkness would not wait for them to be ready. As they made their way back to the hill, the village seemed almost otherworldly. The fog clung to the ground, swirling around their feet, and the cottages that lined the narrow lanes were dark and silent, their windows empty, as if the village had been abandoned. There was no sign of life, no movement, no sound. It was as if the entire place had fallen into a deep slumber, leaving Owen and Evelyn alone with their fears. The path to Blackmoor Hill was steep, the ground uneven, the mist growing thicker with each step they took. Owen could feel the weight of the hill pressing down on him, a palpable force that seemed to push against him, urging him to turn back. But he forced himself to keep moving, his eyes fixed on the dark outline of the church that loomed above them, its crumbling walls barely visible through the fog. They reached the entrance to the churchyard, the gravestones casting long shadows across the ground, their inscriptions worn and unreadable. The air was cold, the kind of cold that sank into the bones and refused to let go. Owen could feel it seeping into him, chilling him to the core, and with it came the whispers, louder now, almost intelligible, a chorus of voices that seemed to echo from the very ground beneath their feet. Evelyn paused at the entrance to the church, her flashlight casting a dim beam across the threshold. She turned to Owen, her eyes wide, her face pale. "Once we're inside, we go straight to the crypt," she said, her voice trembling. "No hesitation, no turning back. We need to end this." Owen nodded, his heart pounding. He could feel the fear gnawing at him, the urge to turn and run, to leave this place and never look back. But there was no escaping it, not anymore. They had crossed a line, and there was no going back. They stepped inside, the cold air of the church washing over them, the darkness seeming to swallow the light of their flashlights. The shadows gathered at the edges of the room, twisting and shifting, taking on forms that Owen could almost recognize, faces that seemed familiar but just out of reach. He shook his head, forcing himself to focus, to keep moving forward. They reached the altar, the stone slab still in place, the symbols carved into its surface seeming to writhe and shift as if alive. Evelyn knelt, her fingers brushing against the stone, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Help me move it," she said, her voice barely audible over the whispers that seemed to grow louder with each passing moment. Owen knelt beside her, his hands pressing against the cold stone, the weight of it almost unbearable as they pushed, the slab shifting with a groan of protest. They moved it aside, revealing the dark, gaping hole that led down to the crypt below. The air that rose from the opening was colder still, a chill that made Owen's skin crawl, that made his breath catch in his throat. Evelyn shone her flashlight down the narrow staircase, the beam revealing the worn steps that led into the darkness. She took a deep breath, her eyes meeting Owen's, and then she began to descend, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Owen followed, his hand resting on the damp stone of the wall, his heart pounding with each step. The crypt was as they had left it, dark, cold, the air thick with the scent of decay. The skeletal remains lay in their niches, their hollow eye sockets seeming to follow them as they moved, the shadows shifting and swirling, taking on forms that should not have been there. The sarcophagus lay in the center of the crypt, its surface blackened and charred, the symbols carved into the stone seeming to pulse with a dark energy. Evelyn approached the sarcophagus, her eyes fixed on the carvings, her fingers tracing the twisted shapes. "These symbols," she said, her voice trembling. "They're meant to bind something, to keep it trapped. Whatever it is, it's still here, Owen. And it's angry." Owen swallowed, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the crypt, the shadows that seemed to shift and move, to take on forms that he couldn't quite understand. He could feel it now, the presence, the anger, the hatred that seemed to seep from the very walls of the crypt, that pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. "What do we do?" Owen asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Evelyn looked at him, her eyes filled with fear. "We have to destroy it," she said, her voice trembling. "Whatever is binding it here, we have to break it. It's the only way." Owen nodded, his heart pounding. He could feel the fear growing stronger, the sense that they were being watched, that something was waiting for them to make a mistake, to cross a line that could not be uncrossed. He took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on the sarcophagus, the symbols that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. They worked in silence, their hands trembling as they scraped away the symbols, the stone cold beneath their fingers, the air growing colder still, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. Owen could feel it now, the presence, the darkness, the anger that seemed to press down on them, that seemed to fill the very air they breathed. And then, with a final desperate effort, the last of the symbols was gone. The air seemed to shift, the cold growing unbearable, the darkness pressing in, the whispers rising to a deafening chorus that seemed to echo from every corner of the crypt. Owen could feel it now, the presence, the hatred, the anger that seemed to fill the very walls, that seemed to reach out for them, to pull them into the darkness. "We need to go," Evelyn said, her voice barely audible over the din, her eyes wide with fear. "Now!" They turned. Their footsteps hurried as they made their way back to the staircase, the darkness pressing in around them, the cold biting at their skin. Owen could feel it now, the sense that they were being pursued, that something was reaching out for them, that something was trying to pull them back. They stumbled up the stairs, the darkness seeming to claw at them, the cold air biting at their skin, their breath coming in ragged gasps. They reached the top, the dim light of the church almost blinding after the darkness below, the air still thick with the scent of decay and something far worse. Evelyn pushed the stone slab back into place, her hands trembling, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Owen helped her, their muscles straining, the stone scraping against the floor, with a sound that seemed to echo through the empty church, a final desperate effort to seal away whatever they had unleashed. When the slab was finally in place, they both stepped back, their breath coming in gasps, their eyes fixed on the floor, the dark outline of the slab seeming to pulse with a life of its own. Owen could feel it still, the presence, the darkness, the hatred that seemed to linger, that seemed to press down on them, a reminder of what they had done. They turned, their footsteps echoing in the silence as they made their way out of the church, the cold air biting at their skin, the fog swirling outside, a reminder that they were still within the grasp of Blackmoor Hill. Owen glanced back, his eyes scanning the dark interior of the church, the shadows that seemed to pulse and shift, a reminder of what lay beneath. They stepped out into the fog, the cold air filling their lungs, the village barely visible through the mist. Owen could feel the fear still gnawing at him, the sense that they had awakened something that was not meant to be disturbed, that they had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. And he knew, deep down, that this was not the end, that whatever they had found in the crypt, whatever they had unleashed, it was not finished with them yet. The darkness of Blackmoor Hill had not let them go, and Owen could feel its presence still, a shadow at the edge of his mind, a reminder that they were not alone, that they had seen something that could not be unseen. Chapter 7. The Lost Settlers. The fog was thicker than ever, rolling over Blackmoor Hill like a malevolent tide as Owen and Evelyn stumbled away from the church. The cold bit at their skin, their breaths coming in short, ragged gasps as they made their way down the hill. But the deeper they went, the more it felt as though the hill itself was pulling at them, dragging them back into its grasp, its whispers echoing louder and louder until it seemed they were all they could hear. They paused at the foot of the hill, their bodies trembling with exhaustion, their flashlights flickering in the dim haze. Owen looked at Evelyn, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She clutched at her notebook, her knuckles white, her gaze darting over the landscape, searching for something that she could not find. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely audible, trembling with something beyond fear, something closer to hopelessness. Owen nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. The whispers had changed. They were no longer calling them back to the church. Instead, they were leading them onward, urging them deeper into the woods that bordered the village. It was as if something beneath the surface of the earth was shifting, awakening, and it wanted them to see what lay hidden in its depths. "They're trying to show us something," Owen said, his voice hollow. He looked toward the woods, the twisted branches of the trees looming like skeletal fingers in the mist. I think they want us to understand what happened here." Evelyn swallowed, her eyes meeting his. "The settlers," she whispered. "The priest. They never left, did they? They're still here, trapped." Owen didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew it was true. The story that had brought him to Blackmoor, the tale of the settlers who had followed the priest to this desolate hill, it had not ended centuries ago as they had thought. It was still unfolding, still alive, and they were now a part of it. Evelyn took a deep breath, her expression hardening with determination. "We have to follow it," she said, her voice steadying. "If we don't understand what happened, if we don't see it for ourselves, we'll never be free of this." Owen nodded, though his stomach churned with fear. He could feel it now, the pull of the whispers, the way they seemed to seep into his mind, guiding his steps. He knew they had no choice. They had to see this through, no matter what lay ahead. They moved forward, their flashlights cutting through the mist, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of damp leaves that covered the forest floor. The fog pressed in around them, the air growing colder still, the whispers echoing louder, more insistent, as they moved deeper into the woods. The trees grew thicker, their branches twisted and gnarled, their bark dark and damp, covered in moss that seemed to pulse with a sickly glow. Owen could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on him, the sense that they were no longer alone, that the eyes of the lost settlers were watching them, their hollow gazes following their every move. They came to a clearing, the ground bare and blackened, as if it had been scorched by fire. In the center of the clearing stood a stone structure, half buried in the earth, its surface covered in the same twisted symbols that they had seen in the crypt beneath the church. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and something far more sinister, something metallic and sharp, a smell that made Owen's skin crawl. Evelyn stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the structure, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She knelt, her fingers brushing against the carvings, her brow furrowing in concentration. "This is it," she said, her voice trembling. "This is where they tried to bind it, to keep it from escaping." Owen swallowed, his eyes scanning the clearing, the shadows that seemed to gather at the edges, shifting and swirling, taking on forms that he could almost recognize. He could hear the whispers growing louder, the voices echoing from the ground beneath their feet, urging them to see, to understand what had happened here. Suddenly, the fog seemed to part, and Owen could see them. The settlers, their hollow eyes staring at him, their faces gaunt and twisted with fear. They were standing in a circle around the stone structure, their hands raised, their mouths moving in silent prayer. In the center of the circle stood the priest, his face obscured by a hood, his hands resting on the stone, his voice echoing in a language that Owen could not understand. The air grew colder still, the fog swirling around them, the shadows shifting and twisting, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. Owen could feel the weight of the place pressing down on him, the sense that he was seeing something that had happened long ago, something that had left its mark on the very earth beneath their feet. Evelyn gasped, her eyes wide, her hand clutching at Owen's arm. "They're trying to bind it," she whispered, her voice filled with awe and fear. "But it's too strong. They couldn't control it." Owen watched, his heart pounding in his chest, as the priest raised his hands, his voice rising to a desperate shout, the settlers echoing his words, their voices filled with fear and desperation. The ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble, the air growing colder still, the fog swirling in a frenzy, the shadows shifting and twisting, taking on forms that seemed to move toward them. And then, with a deafening roar, the ground gave way, the earth splitting open, a darkness rising from the depths, a shadow that seemed to consume everything in its path. The settlers screamed, their voices echoing through the clearing, their bodies consumed by the darkness, their forms fading into the mist until there was nothing left but the echo of their screams. Owen blinked, the vision fading, the clearing empty once more, the stone structure half buried in the earth, the air thick with the scent of decay. He could feel the weight of what he had seen pressing down on him, the sense that they had witnessed something that had not been meant to be seen, that they had glimpsed into the very heart of the darkness that had taken hold of Blackmoor Hill. Evelyn was silent, her eyes wide, her face pale, her hand still clutching at Owen's arm. She looked at him, her voice trembling as she spoke. "They failed, Owen. They tried to bind it, but they failed. And now it's still here, still waiting." Owen nodded, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing with the implications of what they had seen. The settlers, the priest, they had tried to stop it, to seal away whatever darkness had taken hold of the hill, but they had not succeeded. And now that same darkness had awakened once more, drawn by their presence, by their curiosity. "We need to leave," Owen said, his voice trembling, his eyes scanning the clearing, the shadows that seemed to shift and move at the edges of his vision. "We need to get out of here, Evelyn, before it's too late." Evelyn nodded, her face pale, her eyes filled with fear. She turned, her footsteps hurried as she moved back toward the path that led out of the clearing, her flashlight cutting through the mist, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Owen followed, his heart pounding, his eyes scanning the shadows, the sense that they were being watched, that the eyes of the lost settlers were still upon them, urging them to leave, to save themselves from the fate that had befallen them. The fog pressed in around them, the whispers growing fainter as they moved further from the clearing, the air growing colder still, the sense of unease gnawing at Owen's mind. He could feel it now, the presence that had awakened, the darkness that had taken hold of Blackmoor Hill, a shadow that lingered at the edge of his thoughts, a reminder that they had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. They stumbled out of the woods, the village barely visible through the mist, the cottages dark and empty, the air thick with the scent of decay. Owen could feel the weight of what they had seen pressing down on him, the sense that they had glimpsed into a darkness that could not be forgotten, a darkness that would follow them wherever they went. Evelyn looked at him, her eyes filled with fear, her voice trembling as she spoke. "It's not over, Owen. It's still here, and it's not going to rest until it's free." Owen nodded, his heart heavy, his eyes scanning the mist-shrouded village, the shadows that seemed to pulse and shift, a reminder of the darkness that had taken hold of Blackmoor Hill. He knew, deep down, that they had not escaped, that whatever they had awakened, whatever they had seen, it was not finished with them yet. And as they made their way back to the safety of Evelyn's cottage, Owen could feel it still, a presence at the edge of his mind, a shadow that followed him, a reminder that they were not alone, that the darkness of Blackmoor Hill had taken hold of them, and it would not let go. Chapter 8. The Priest's Curse. The village of Blackmoor was cloaked in a silence so deep that it felt like the air itself had been drained of life. The mist hung heavy, curling around the darkened cottages, their windows empty and black, as if the souls of those who had once lived here had long since fled. Owen and Evelyn stumbled through the narrow, cobblestoned streets, their breaths ragged, their flashlights flickering as if they too were on the verge of giving up. It was not just exhaustion that gripped Owen now. It was something deeper, something that had rooted itself in his bones. He could feel the hill's malevolent pull, a silent force that whispered in his ear, urging him to return. His mind was filled with visions of the settlers, their hollow faces twisted in terror, as they tried in vain to contain the darkness. He could see the priest at the center of it all, his hooded figure commanding the shadows with an authority that seemed both desperate and twisted. Evelyn stumbled beside him, her eyes hollow, her face pale as she fought to keep moving. The fog seemed to thicken around them, every step an effort, as if they were wading through something unseen, something that resisted their movement. Owen's heart pounded in his chest, and with each passing moment, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, like claws raking at the inside of his mind. They reached Evelyn's cottage, its small form barely visible through the fog, and she fumbled with the key, her hands trembling as she unlocked the door. They hurried inside, slamming the door behind them, as if they could shut out the darkness that followed. The small fire in the hearth had long since died, leaving the room cold, the shadows thick and menacing, seeming to pulse with each flicker of the flashlight. Evelyn collapsed onto a chair, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Owen stood in the middle of the room, his hands trembling as he tried to steady himself. He could still feel it, the presence, the darkness, the pull of something ancient and hateful. It was as if the very walls of the cottage were closing in on him, the shadows pressing in, wrapping around him like a suffocating shroud. "Evelyn," Owen said, his voice strained, barely more than a whisper. "We have to understand what this is. The priest, the settlers. There has to be something more. Why were they trying to bind it? What went wrong?" Evelyn looked up at him, her eyes wide, her expression one of desperation. "The priest," she whispered. "He was obsessed. He thought he could control it, that he could harness whatever dark power lay beneath Blackmoor Hill. He led the settlers here, promising them a new beginning, a place where they could be free. But it was a lie." Owen nodded, his heart heavy. He could see it now. He could see the settlers, their hopes twisted into something terrible, something that had consumed them, body and soul. The priest had led them into darkness, had promised them salvation, but had instead delivered them into a nightmare from which there was no escape. Evelyn stood, her eyes filled with determination. "We have to go back, Owen. We have to end this. The priest, whatever he awakened, whatever he tried to bind, it's still there, and it won't rest until it's free." Owen swallowed, his throat dry, his mind racing. The thought of returning to Blackmoor Hill filled him with dread. But he knew that Evelyn was right. There was no escaping this, not now. They had crossed a line and the darkness would not let them go. They had to face it, had to find a way to put an end to whatever horror the priest had unleashed. "We need to find out more," Owen said, his voice trembling. "The settlers' records, the journals, anything that can tell us what the priest was trying to do." Evelyn nodded, moving to the small bookshelf in the corner of the room. She pulled down an old, dusty tome, her fingers brushing across the worn leather cover. "I found this in the church's archives," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "It's the priest's journal. It's written in an old dialect, but I've been trying to translate it. There are parts that I still don't understand, but it talks about rituals, about binding and sacrifice." He was desperate, Owen. He thought he could use the darkness to protect them, but instead it consumed them. Owen took the book from her, his hands trembling as he opened it. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, the words scrawled in a frantic, almost manic hand. He could feel the weight of the priest's madness in every line, the desperation, the fear that had driven him to do the unthinkable. He turned the pages, his eyes scanning the text, the symbols that had been drawn in the margins, symbols that he recognized from the crypt, from the clearing in the woods, the same twisted shapes, the same dark energy that seemed to pulse from the very paper, a reminder of the power that had been awakened, of the curse that had taken hold of Blackmoor Hill. He thought he could control it, Evelyn said, her voice trembling. He thought that by sacrificing the settlers, by binding their souls to the hill, he could keep the darkness contained. But it didn't work. It was too strong. And now it's feeding off of us, Owen. It's feeding off our fear, our pain. It's growing stronger. Owen felt a chill run down his spine, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a physical force. He could see it now. The settlers, their souls trapped, their bodies consumed by the darkness, their fear and despair feeding the very thing they had tried to contain. And now, centuries later, that darkness had awakened once more, drawn by their presence, by their curiosity. "We have to end this," Owen said, his voice filled with determination. "We have to find a way to break the curse, to free the settlers, to put an end to this once and for all." Evelyn nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. The journal talks about a final ritual, a way to break the binding, to release the souls that are trapped. But it's dangerous, Owen. The priest tried, and he failed. If we're not careful, we could end up just like them. Owen took a deep breath, his hands tightening around the book. "We have to try," he said, his voice steady. "We can't let this continue. We have to finish what the settlers started. We have to end the priest's curse." They spent the rest of the night preparing, gathering what supplies they could find: candles, matches, a piece of chalk to draw the symbols that the journal described. The air in the cottage was thick with tension, the whispers outside growing louder, more insistent, as if the darkness knew what they were planning and was determined to stop them. The fog had not lifted by morning. If anything, it had grown thicker, the village barely visible, the world beyond the cottage reduced to a swirling mass of grey. Owen and Evelyn stood at the edge of the village, their faces pale, their hands trembling as they looked toward the hill, its dark outline just visible through the mist. "We can do this," Owen said, his voice filled with a determination that he didn't entirely feel. "We have to do this. For the settlers. For ourselves." Evelyn nodded, her eyes filled with fear and resolve. She took a deep breath, her fingers brushing against the worn cover of the priest's journal. "We have to be careful, Owen. We can't make the same mistakes they did. We have to finish this, once and for all." They moved forward, the path to Blackmoor Hill steep and treacherous, the fog pressing in around them, the whispers growing louder with each step. The air was cold, the kind of cold that sank into their bones, that filled them with a dread that they could not shake. The hill loomed above them, the church a dark silhouette against the sky, its crumbling walls seeming to watch them, to judge them. They reached the clearing, the stone structure half buried in the earth, the ground blackened and bare. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the fog swirling around them, the whispers echoing from the ground beneath their feet, urging them to turn back, to abandon their quest. But they could not. They had come too far, and there was no turning back now. Evelyn knelt, her hands trembling as she drew the symbols on the ground, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Owen stood beside her, his eyes scanning the clearing, the shadows that seemed to gather at the edges, shifting and swirling, taking on forms that he could almost recognize. He could feel the weight of the place pressing down on him, the sense that they were standing at the threshold of something terrible, something that could not be undone. "We have to be quick," Evelyn said, her voice trembling as she lit the candles, their flames flickering in the cold air. "Once we start, there's no stopping. We have to see it through, no matter what happens." Owen nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel it now, the presence, the darkness, the anger that seemed to seep from the very earth beneath their feet, that seemed to press down on them, making it hard to breathe. He took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on the symbols, the twisted shapes that seemed to pulse with a dark energy, a reminder of the power they were about to face. Evelyn began to chant, her voice barely audible over the whispers that seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as if the very earth beneath them was crying out in protest. Owen knelt beside her, his hands trembling as he placed the candles in the positions the journal had described, his eyes scanning the clearing, the shadows that seemed to move closer, their forms shifting and twisting, taking on shapes that he could almost recognize. The air grew colder still, the fog swirling around them, the ground beneath their feet trembling as if something beneath the surface was struggling to break free. Owen could feel it now, the presence, the darkness, the hatred that seemed to seep from the very earth, that seemed to wrap around them, suffocating them. And then, with a final desperate shout, Evelyn finished the chant, her voice rising above the whispers, above the howling wind that swept through the clearing. The ground beneath them seemed to shudder, the fog swirling in a frenzy, the shadows shifting and twisting, their forms fading, dissipating, until there was nothing left but the cold, empty air. The whispers ceased, the fog beginning to lift, the clearing suddenly silent, the air still. Owen took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest, his eyes scanning the clearing, the stone structure that stood silent and still, the symbols on the ground glowing faintly before fading away. Evelyn looked at him, her eyes wide, her face pale, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "Did it work?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Did we do it?" Owen swallowed, his throat dry, his eyes scanning the clearing, the shadows that had once loomed so close now seeming distant, their presence fading. He nodded, his heart heavy, his voice filled with a mixture of hope and fear. I think we did." But deep down, Owen knew that this was not the end. The darkness of Blackmoor Hill had not been vanquished. It had only been pushed back, held at bay for a little while longer. And as they stood in the clearing, the air still and silent around them, Owen could feel it still, a presence at the edge of his mind, a reminder that they were not alone, that the darkness was still there, waiting, watching, and it would not let go. Chapter 9. Shadows Come Alive. The stillness of the clearing was suffocating, as if the entire world had paused to listen. The fog that had started to lift now seemed to hang in a hesitant suspension, reluctant to disperse entirely, as though it were tethered to something unseen and malignant beneath the earth. Owen's heart hammered in his chest, and he shared a brief, fearful look with Evelyn, her face pale against the grey shroud that surrounded them. Their breaths were uneven, exhausted from the ritual they had just performed. Evelyn's hands were shaking, the smudges of the symbols they had drawn now a faint outline in the dirt. The air was no longer howling, but a deep silence replaced it, a silence that weighed heavily, like a thick quilt smothering every sound, every thought. But then, a movement, a flicker at the edge of the clearing. Owen turned his head sharply, catching sight of something shifting in the fog. He blinked, his eyes struggling to focus, to understand what he was seeing. Evelyn let out a shaky breath, her flashlight trembling in her hand as she scanned the mist. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Owen nodded, swallowing against the dryness in his throat. "Yeah," he said, his voice barely audible, even in the unnatural silence. He squinted into the darkness, his eyes darting back and forth. There, among the thickening fog, the shadows seemed to gather, coalescing, shifting, taking form. And then he saw them, the settlers, or what remained of them. The figures emerged from the fog like spectres, half-formed, hollow, their faces twisted with the same terror he had seen in his visions. They moved silently, their feet barely touching the earth, their dark eyes fixed on Owen and Evelyn. Owen's stomach twisted with a wave of nausea. He could see their mouths moving, forming words, but no sound came out, only that unbearable silence, as if the world had turned its back on them. Evelyn stepped back, her breath quickening, her fingers brushing against Owen's arm in a desperate attempt to steady herself. "They're not gone," she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief and growing panic. "The ritual, it didn't work." Owen shook his head, his pulse pounding in his ears. He wanted to deny it, wanted to believe that they had succeeded, that they had done what the settlers could not. But the truth was right there before them, undeniable and dreadful. The darkness that they had sought to banish had not been destroyed. It had merely been awakened, and now it had taken on a new, more terrible form. "We need to get out of here," Owen said, his voice trembling, his eyes fixed on the settlers, their hollow forms inching closer, their faces distorted by agony. He grabbed Evelyn's arm, pulling her with him as he backed away from the clearing, his flashlight barely penetrating the mist, which seemed to cling to them, growing thicker with each passing moment. But there was no escaping it. The shadows moved with them, gliding silently across the ground, the settlers' dark eyes following them with an unrelenting intensity. It was as if the entire hill had come alive, the earth itself shifting beneath their feet, the fog swirling in strange unnatural patterns. The air grew colder, the chill biting into their skin, making it difficult to move, to think. Evelyn stumbled, her hand slipping from Owen's grip as she fell to her knees, her flashlight clattering to the ground. Owen turned, his heart lurching as he reached for her. "Evelyn!" he shouted, his voice breaking through the silence, echoing across the empty clearing. But the shadows were there, reaching for her, their forms bending and shifting, fingers of darkness extending toward her like tendrils. Evelyn's eyes were wide, her face pale, her breath coming in short gasps as she tried to scramble away. "They're trying to take me," she gasped, her voice filled with terror. "They want us, Owen. They need us." Owen lunged for her, his hands wrapping around her arms, pulling her to her feet. He could feel the chill of the shadows, the way they seemed to cling to her, to him, a coldness that went beyond mere temperature, a coldness that seemed to seep into their very souls. He pulled her close, his eyes locking onto hers, the fear mirrored between them. "We have to move. We can't let them touch us. We have to get away." They stumbled together, their feet moving awkwardly over the uneven ground, their flashlights flickering as if the very batteries had given up against the oppressive darkness. The settlers moved closer still, their forms now fully emerged from the fog, their twisted expressions filled with a hollow emptiness, a hunger that could never be satisfied. Their mouths continued to move, their words silent, but Owen could feel them, could feel their despair, their anger, their longing to be free. The shadows grew darker, more solid, taking on shapes that were no longer merely human. They twisted and writhed, stretching upward, the air around them seeming to shimmer with a malevolent energy. Owen felt his chest tighten, a sense of utter helplessness washing over him. They couldn't fight this. They couldn't outrun it. The darkness was everywhere, surrounding them, pressing in on all sides. A scream tore through the silence. Evelyn's voice, raw and terrified. Owen turned, his eyes widening in horror as he saw one of the shadows wrap itself around her, its form shifting, twisting, enveloping her like a shroud. Her flashlight fell from her hand, the beam flickering as it hit the ground, the shadows consuming it. "Evelyn!" Owen shouted, his voice hoarse, his heart pounding in his chest. He lunged for her, his fingers brushing against her arm, but it was like trying to grasp smoke. She was slipping away, her body disappearing into the darkness, her eyes wide with fear, her mouth open in a silent scream. "No!" Owen screamed, his voice breaking, his hands grasping at nothing but air. He stumbled forward, his knees hitting the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The shadows swirled around him, their coldness wrapping around his body, their whispers now deafening, a cacophony of voices that seemed to echo from the very earth itself. The settlers were still there, their hollow eyes fixed on him, their forms flickering, fading in and out of the mist. Owen could feel their despair, their fear, their anger, emotions that seemed to bleed into him, filling him with a hopelessness so deep that it threatened to swallow him whole. He could feel the weight of their curse, the darkness that bound them to this place, the hatred that had festered for centuries. Owen's vision blurred, his body trembling as he fought to stay conscious. He could feel the darkness pressing in on him, the shadows wrapping around him, dragging him down, pulling him towards something he could not see. He knew in that moment that there was no escaping it, that the darkness had claimed them, just as it had claimed the settlers, just as it had claimed the priest. But then, a light. Faint at first, barely more than a flicker, but it grew, cutting through the fog, through the shadows, a bright, searing light that seemed to burn away the darkness. Owen blinked, his eyes struggling to focus, to understand what he was seeing. The shadows recoiled, their forms twisting, dissipating, the settlers fading back into the mist, their hollow eyes filled with a longing that broke Owen's heart. Evelyn's voice, a whisper, barely audible. "Owen, get up!" He forced himself to his feet, his body trembling, his eyes searching for her. There, in the light, her form barely visible, her hand reaching for him. He stumbled toward her, his fingers brushing against hers, the light growing brighter, the shadows pulling away, the fog lifting. They stood together, their hands clasped, the light surrounding them, the shadows retreating, fading into the night. Owen could feel the darkness still, could feel its presence, its hatred, but it was distant now, held at bay by the light that surrounded them. Evelyn looked at him, her eyes filled with tears, her voice trembling. "We're not done, Owen. This isn't over, but we have a chance to fight it, to end it." Owen nodded, his heart heavy, his eyes scanning the clearing, the shadows that still lingered at the edges of his vision. He knew she was right. The darkness had not been vanquished. It had only been pushed back, held at bay for a little while longer. And as they stood there, the light slowly fading, the fog beginning to close in once more, Owen knew that they would have to face it again, that the battle was far from over, and that the shadows would come alive once more. But for now, they had each other, and they had the light, and that, Owen thought, would have to be enough. Chapter 10. The Haunting Legacy. The morning came reluctantly, pushing through the oppressive fog that still clung to Blackmoor Hill like a bad memory. Owen and Evelyn had barely rested, their bodies trembling from exhaustion, their minds haunted by the events of the previous night. The light that had saved them had faded, leaving only the cold, empty dawn, the fog swirling like ghosts around their feet. They stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at the remains of what they had done. The candles, now nothing but stubs, the symbols they had drawn in chalk smudged and almost erased. The ground beneath their feet was still, but Owen could feel the unease coursing through his veins, an unnatural discomfort that told him this was not over. The darkness might have retreated, but it was there, waiting, lurking just beyond the veil of the mist. Evelyn glanced at Owen, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. "We have to go back," she whispered, her voice raw. "We need to get away from here. It's not done with us, Owen. I can feel it." Owen nodded, his throat tight, his voice barely a whisper. "But where can we go?" he asked, his eyes scanning the dark, looming trees, their branches twisted and gnarled. He knew there was no escaping this. No matter where they went, no matter how far they ran, the darkness would follow. It had marked them, claimed them, and it would not let them go until it had finished what it had started. Evelyn swallowed hard, her gaze distant as she looked toward the village, barely visible through the mist. "We have to try. Maybe we can find someone who knows more, someone who can help us break this curse." Her voice trembled, and she looked at Owen with a glimmer of hope, a hope that was fragile and close to breaking. "We can't stay here. If we do, we'll end up like the settlers, trapped, consumed by it." Owen took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs, making him shiver. He knew she was right. They couldn't stay here. They had seen what happened to those who stayed, the hollow eyes, the twisted forms of the settlers, forever bound to the hill, their souls caught in an endless cycle of torment. He didn't want that for himself, and he didn't want that for Evelyn. "Let's go," Owen said, his voice filled with a determination that he didn't entirely feel. He reached for Evelyn's hand, pulling her gently with him as they turned away from the clearing, the dark presence of the hill looming behind them. The fog seemed to cling to them, pulling at their clothes as if reluctant to let them go, whispering secrets that they could not understand. They moved through the woods, their footsteps slow, each step a struggle against the exhaustion that weighed them down. The forest was silent, unnaturally so, the only sound the crunch of their feet on the damp leaves. The fog wrapped around the twisted branches of the trees, creating strange, shifting forms that seemed to move in the corner of Owen's vision, shadows that refused to disappear. Evelyn stumbled, her hand slipping from Owen's as she fell to her knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps. I can't," she whispered, her voice filled with despair. "It's too much. It's like it's pulling at me, dragging me back. Tears glistened in her eyes, and she looked up at Owen, her face pale, her expression one of utter exhaustion and fear. Owen knelt beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder, his voice trembling. "We have to keep moving, Evelyn. We can't let it take us. We have to fight it, together." He could feel the weight of the darkness pressing down on them, the whispers echoing in his mind, urging him to give in, to let it all end. Evelyn closed her eyes, her body trembling, and for a moment, Owen feared that she would give up, that she would let the darkness take her. But then she took a deep breath, her eyes opening, her gaze meeting his. There was fear there, but there was also something else. Determination. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. Together. Owen helped her to her feet, his arm wrapped around her shoulders as they continued their slow, unsteady journey through the woods. The fog seemed to grow thicker, the air colder, the trees closing in around them, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Owen could feel the presence of the hill behind them, a malevolent force that refused to be forgotten, that lingered just at the edge of his consciousness. They reached the edge of the forest, the village of Blackmoor just visible through the swirling mist. The cottages were dark, their windows empty and lifeless, as if the village itself had given up, resigned to its fate. Owen felt a pang of sadness as he looked at the empty streets. The place that had once been a home to so many now little more than a ghost town, haunted by the memories of those who had come before. Evelyn turned to him, her eyes filled with tears, her voice trembling. "We have to tell someone, Owen. We can't keep this to ourselves. The darkness, it's too strong. We need help." Owen nodded, his throat tight, his voice barely a whisper. "We will," he said, his eyes scanning the village, the shadows that seemed to gather at the edges of the streets, shifting and twisting in the mist. He knew they had to leave, to find someone who could help them, someone who understood what they were dealing with. But deep down, he also knew that no one could truly understand, that the darkness was beyond comprehension, beyond reason. They moved through the village, their footsteps echoing in the silence, the fog wrapping around the cottages like a shroud. Owen could feel the weight of the place pressing down on him, the memories of the settlers, the priest, the rituals they had performed, all of it lingering in the air, a reminder of the darkness that had taken hold of Blackmoor Hill. They reached Evelyn's cottage, the small structure barely visible through the thick fog. Owen pushed open the door, guiding Evelyn inside, the air inside the cottage cold and still. He closed the door behind them, leaning against it for a moment, his body trembling with exhaustion. The shadows gathered at the edges of the room, their forms shifting and swirling, a reminder that the darkness was still with them, that it had not been defeated. Evelyn sank into a chair, her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Owen moved to the window, his eyes scanning the village, the fog that still clung to the ground, the dark outline of Blackmoor Hill barely visible in the distance. He could feel it still, the presence, the darkness, the hatred that seemed to seep from the very earth. A reminder that they had not escaped, that they were still marked, still bound to the hill. "We can't stay here," Evelyn said, her voice trembling, her eyes filled with tears as she looked up at Owen. "We have to leave, Owen. We have to get as far away from here as we can." Owen nodded, his heart heavy, his eyes filled with a sadness that he could not put into words. He knew she was right. They couldn't stay. The darkness would find them, would consume them, just as it had consumed the settlers, the priest. They had to leave, to find a way to break the curse, to free themselves from the hold of Blackmoor Hill. But even as he nodded, Owen knew that there was no escaping it, that no matter how far they ran, the darkness would follow. It had marked them, claimed them, and it would not rest until it had finished what it had started. And as he looked out at the village, the fog swirling like ghosts in the morning light, he knew that the battle was far from over, that the darkness would come for them again. Evelyn stood, her body trembling, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "We'll leave tonight," she said, her voice steadying. "We'll pack what we can carry and head out. We'll find someone who can help us. We'll find a way to end this." Owen nodded, his heart pounding, his mind racing. He turned from the window, his eyes meeting Evelyn's, her gaze filled with a hope that was fragile but real. He knew they had to try, had to fight no matter the cost. For the settlers, for the village, for themselves. And as they stood together in the cold, darkened cottage, the shadows gathering around them, Owen could feel the presence of the hill, the darkness that had taken hold of it. A reminder that they were not alone, that they had seen something that could not be forgotten, that could not be undone. They had each other, and they had hope. And as long as they had that, Owen thought, they had a chance to fight, to end the priest's curse, to free themselves from the darkness that had claimed Blackmoor Hill. And that, for now, would have to be enough. Epilogue. The endless shadow. The road away from Blackmoor was winding and shrouded in mist, as if the village itself were reluctant to let them leave. The car's headlights cut through the fog, revealing glimpses of the twisted, ancient trees that lined the narrow path. Owen gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white, his heart pounding in his chest. Beside him, Evelyn stared straight ahead, her eyes hollow, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and hope. They were leaving, but they both knew it wasn't over. The darkness they had encountered on Blackmoor Hill was not bound by the physical constraints of the village. It was a force, a presence that had latched onto them, an endless shadow that would follow them wherever they went, but they couldn't stay. They had to try to outrun it, to find someone who could help them, to fight against the curse that had taken hold of their lives. The road twisted and turned, the mist growing thicker, and Owen felt the weight of the hill still pressing down on him, the whispers of the lost settlers echoing in his mind. He glanced at Evelyn, her face pale in the dim light of the dashboard, her eyes closed as if she were trying to shut out the memories of what they had seen, what they had faced. And then, out of the corner of his eye, Owen saw it. A shadow, fleeting, darting through the mist along the edge of the road. His heart skipped a beat, his breath catching in his throat. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the darkness, but the shadow was gone, swallowed by the fog. He looked at Evelyn, but she hadn't noticed, her eyes still closed, her breathing slow and steady. Owen turned his gaze back to the road, a chill running down his spine. He knew that they were not alone, that the darkness was still with them, waiting, watching. It had not been defeated, only pushed back, and it would come for them again. It was patient, relentless, and it would not rest until it had claimed them. But as the road stretched out before them, disappearing into the mist, Owen felt a flicker of hope. They had survived. They had faced the darkness, and they had survived. And as long as they were alive, there was a chance to fight, to break the curse, to free themselves from the shadow that had claimed Blackmoor Hill. Evelyn stirred beside him, her eyes opening, her gaze meeting his. She gave him a faint smile, her hand reaching for his, her fingers intertwining with his. "We'll make it, Owen," she whispered, her voice filled with a quiet determination. "We'll find a way." Owen nodded, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, the mist swirling like ghosts around them. "Yes," he said, his voice steady. "We will." And as they drove away from Blackmoor, the village fading into the fog behind them, Owen knew that the battle was far from over. The darkness was still there, an endless shadow that would follow them wherever they went. But they had each other, and they had hope. And as long as they had that, they had a chance. And for now, that was enough.